I'll start. Welcome everyone to the inaugural Public Anthropology lecture in the Department of Anthropology at York University. I'm Carl Schmid, faculty in the Department of Anthropology and the MC for this event. We are very pleased to have so many of you here today, members of First Nations, faculty of different departments and universities, undergraduate students, graduate students, and interested members of the public. We even have some people attending from the West Coast and the East Coast, so welcome all. This promises to be an interesting talk and discussion. I would now like to introduce my colleague, Shubhra Gururani, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Anthropology.
Thank you, Carl. Wonderful to see so many of you. I guess this is our life that allows us to see you virtually. Former colleagues, colleagues you normally would bump into in Barry Hall or in York Lanes, whom you now see virtually, and lots of students and alumni. So I'm delighted to welcome you. Thank you so much for coming for the event. This is a very special event for us, and I'm really delighted and honored that Professor Darrel Manitowabi will be delivering our first annual lecture in public anthropology and discussing the challenges of taking anthropology to the real world. Before we proceed, I would like us to take a few moments to learn about the territories we reside in. Since we are attending this virtually from all over the country and beyond in different time zones and places, the acknowledgement I read may not stand for all the different territories you're in. As faculty members, staff, students, and alumni of York University, we recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Innu, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lake regions. Now to public anthropology at York. The Department of Anthropology, as many of you probably know, has long upheld its commitment to community-engaged research and teaching and adhered to its motto of making knowledge count. And in 2018, even though we've been offering courses in 2018, to materialize that commitment, we launched our certificate in public anthropology, which we call Advocacy and Public Engagement for our undergraduate students. The certificate embraces the goal of pursuing an engaged anthropology both locally and globally. As part of the certificate, which we hope to extend to our graduate program as well, offers at the undergraduate level, offers courses at second, third, and fourth year levels, and provides anthropological skills in community engaged learning and trains students to uphold the commitment to conduct publicly accessible and responsible research. The certificate also has a fourth year placement course, and I see some of you who are in the placement course and those courses are attending the lecture. I'm delighted to see you, welcome. And today we are formally launching the Public Anthropology Lecture Series. The Public Anthropology certificate and our curricular goals align well with York University's academic plan. And the person I would like to invite to speak to the certificate and to our general academic planning is Associate Dean Lily Cho. But before I ask Professor Cho to speak, I have a few housekeeping comments to make. I'm especially delighted that Professor Naomi Adelson, who has been a long-time former colleague at the Department of Anthropology, also the former chair of the department and the associate dean at the faculty, is here to join us. And please, Naomi, I hope everybody can see you. And finally, I also would like to thank Carl Schmid for helping me launch this public anthropology lecture series. If you could you please unmute your mics for a minute? and join me in giving Carl a very big round of applause.
Wow.
Thank you, Carl. And I also would like to thank Rosemary Coombe for extending her support in making this event possible. And as always, last but not the least, a big hand of applause for Colleen Robinson, our departmental administrative assistant, who has taken care of all the logistics and helped us host this event. Thank you, Carl, Rosemary, and Colleen once again. I would now like to invite Professor Lily Cho to say a few words about the faculty and to York's commitment to community engaged teaching and learning. Professor Cho is the Associate Dean, Global and Community Engagement. She's a scholar of Canadian literature and post-colonial theory and has written extensively on the Chinese diaspora, food, eating, restaurants, and racialization in Canada. More recently, Associate Dean Cho has co-edited a book on the relationship between human rights and creative expression. Lily, over to you.
Thank you so much, Shubhra, Carl. What a huge honor it is to be here. And thank you to all of you for joining us in launching what I think is going to be a historic and terrific event. What a great pleasure it is to have this opportunity to welcome you on behalf of the Office of the Dean of the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies to this inaugural public anthropology lecture. At a moment when so much of our physical lives are increasingly circumscribed by the demands of the pandemic, it is especially wonderful and commendable that the Department of Anthropology at York University is giving us this moment to think about the idea of publics and the public sphere in ways that challenge and inspire the communities we inhabit. Congratulations to the department, to our extraordinarily distinguished guest speaker and discussant, and most of all, welcome and thank you for being a part of this important and exciting event. We are so thrilled to see all of you here and to support the work that this department and these communities that this department is bringing together here. Thank you again, and I hope you have I know this will be a wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. I'm so glad you could make the time to come and say a few words. I would now like to introduce Mary Lalonde. Mary is a very special guest who has kindly joined us for the event. There's a little story behind how Mary and I came to know each other and why Mary is here. In the interest of time, I will keep it brief. When I was putting together the poster for the talk, which many of you probably have seen, recognizing the topic of the talk and in an attempt to express solidarity, I adopted the logo of the Anishinaabe governance in our poster without reaching out for permission. Even though it was respectful, I now realize it was a mistake. The use of the logo led to several phone conversations with Mary, who told me that about the meaning and the power of the logo and gave us the permission to use the logo as long as we learn what the logo stands for. Mary and Professor Manitowabi both will speak about the logo in their presentations. Beyond what we will learn from the presentations, I would like to acknowledge, as we launch our certificate in public anthropology, that the use of Anishinaabe governance logo was an important lesson for us to be highly conscious and careful about how we engage with the First Nations communities and how we conduct responsible community engaged anthropology. Equally importantly, as anthropologists, we believe that symbols have power. And I believe it was through the power of the logo that I came to know Mary and was able to extend our invitation to her, which Mary very graciously accepted. Mary Lalonde specializes in Anishinaabe governance and for over 2 decades has worked on Anishinaabe self-governance, land stewardship, community development, consultation, and communications. Mary is currently the Restoration of Jurisdiction Communications Coordinator. I'm truly delighted that Mary is joining us from North Bay to say a few words about the logo and about the work they have been doing. I hope this is the beginning of a long relationship and solidarity with the Anishinaabe Nation and York University. Thank you, Mary, and please, Over to you.
Oh, miigwech. Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to speak today about the work that we're doing at the Anishinaabe Nation. And I'm going to talk more about the work that we're doing, and because Darrel is quite able and very willing to talk about the meaning of the logo itself. And but I just, about the logo, the only thing that I want to say is it's kind of like a happy accident, I guess. And I thought it was a little bit ironic too, that, you know, the way that it all, because what we're trying to do with this public, with your new initiative. And anyway, and it's also about that new initiative. It's really an honor to be here for the launch. So, and again, that's just, you know, the way that the universe had it planned out for us. So thank you so much. First of all, I have a couple of remarks to make about the name of Professor Manitowabi's talk today. Having grown up, of course, in the prime cottage country in Temagami, on Lake Temagami. And I'll tell you right now that behind the paradise is up in the hill where the servants live. There is a segregated community. That's what I grew up in. I grew up in white privilege, wealthy American fishermen, mostly at a fishing lodge. My dad was a guide. My mother was a waitress, and my experience in Canada has been on the outside looking in. I think that is probably the experience for a lot of young Native children, or Anishinaabe children, is that you don't see yourself reflected in a good way when you look outside. And so, I mean, you know, there's lots to be said about those kinds of things. White privilege, you know, white privilege has come to mean to me that everything is measured by whiteness. That's the standard. And so, and that's not one that I'll ever be able to live up to. So, and that's my childhood reality. And that has followed me along. I'm still subjected to racism here in my father's home community, which is Nipissing First Nation, which is where I'm at today. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm in Nipissing First Nation lands. So that's what's behind the paradise. But more pointed to what we're talking about today is this. I was talking to Professor Manitowabi about the connection between language and culture and wellness. And so what we've been looking at is, with regards to us being on the outside looking in, we're trying to say, okay, well, let's look inside. Because, you know, when we talk about looking, we talk about treaty rights. Well, we had rights before there were treaties. We have inherent rights, and that's what that means, inherent. There are rights pre-existing. Treaties are only well, no, I shouldn't say only, because they're so important, because they recognize that we are nations. And that was the original intent of those treaties, that we would be able to live freely as Anishinaabe people with our brothers in friendship and peace with the settlers that came to our country and wanted to live here. And so the treaties were about that recognition, mutual responsibility, and also coexistence. So, and that's where we want to go. So my remarks are not to separate us, but to keep us separate in a context of respect and in a context of freedom. Because Wade Davis said this, and it really stuck in my mind, that we are not failed attempts at being you. So I know that everyone is taking that in the most kind way, because I just need to say that to you, because we need to look to Anishinaabe law. We need to look internally. That's where our answers are. And so, so what I'm trying to say is about building bridges of peace and friendship, but not joining, because we can't do that. That's not who we are. And we were created as Anishinaabe people and placed on these lands by the Creator. That's the inherent right. And we have a right to be who we are. So that's what we're working towards in our governance agreement, is reclaiming those things that were taken away from us with very, very brutally and with very poor consequences post-treaty. When the military power changed, that's when there was the Indian Act, that's when there was residential schools. And so there has been this complete assault on, on the government trying to make us extinct. I mean, the first Indian Act is called an Act for the Gradual Civilization of the Indians. And so, but what we were doing was totally civilized. You know, we had a beautiful system of governance, we had language, we had spirituality, we had all those things that we know make a nation of people. And so that's what we're trying to reclaim, because that is our truth, and that's where we need to go to see we need to take these things and reclaim them, and not and then come forward to the world and in partnership. That is friendship and peace, but not what we've been used to. And, you know, Canada, we all know about the systemic racism in Canada, and those are all things I know that we're all trying to work on. So I just want to say in closing that we see that our language and culture, like Anishinaabe governance itself is in our language. All that knowledge of everything is relational to our world and one another. And all that knowledge is in our language. And so this is our foundation for self-determination and our foundation for survival. So it's our culture, which is ceremony, our identity, our governance system, and all these things that was the subject of the genocide that was waged against us. And I use that word very succinctly, and I mean that word, because that is what happened. We had a hard time saying that, but now we need to say that, and because that's what we're dealing with. That's our legacy under colonialism. And so we're looking at that, how you know, our language is still declining. It's everything to us, because everything is in it, our worldview, our knowledge. And so, you know, we have our youth dying from overdoses, high incidence of serious health issues, violence against women and girls, serious environmental problems, and the Indian Act, and all the way that we have been lately in our own country. This is what we're trying to turn around. And we see that all of these issues come back to language and our traditions and our culture and our history, who we are, and because of our worldview. So our elders are telling us that we need to return to the spirit, because that is our first law. Is Nagodwe Wanagas Anishinaabe, one Anishinaabe family, and the Creator placed Anishinaabe on the earth along with the gift of spirituality. And so I hope that I've, you know, tried to say a lot in a very short time, probably went over my time as I always do. And I want to thank you so much for listening to me, Miigwech, and it's such a wonderful opportunity to be here with you today.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you for your powerful words, and thanks for sharing, and also for your honesty. I'm now going to introduce our speaker for today, and also our discussant. And in doing so, I just want to recognize that I wanted to go a little against the grain in terms of always looking, or not always, but often looking southward for speakers, and beginning to, as we wish to do with the certificate, is to involve ourselves more in the communities, to hear the many voices that are out there, and to work collaboratively as much as we can. So Professor Manitowabi is our speaker today. He's Associate Professor in Human Sciences and the inaugural AMS Hanna Chair in the History of Indigenous Health and Indigenous Traditional Medicine at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. Professor Manitowabi has served as the Director of Northern and Community Studies at Laurentian University. At the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, he was previously the Director of Indigenous Affairs and Assistant Dean of Graduate Studies. This new and prestigious position as AMS Hanna Chair will allow him to research the history of Indigenous healing and health, the impact of colonialism, and contribute to the development of healthcare today. He is helping to develop curriculum at the medical school and with graduate students to bring in a new perspective on what traditional healing involves from a holistic perspective. Some of the projects Professor Manitowabi has been involved in include oral history work on the treaties and providing expert testimony on behalf of First Nations contesting the Williams Treaties of 1923, as we will hear about today. Part of Manitowabi's talk will explore his own experience, the role of the applied anthropologist, and the ethics of applied anthropology based on experiences he has had in advocacy, collaboration, as well as with treaty litigation. I was very happy when Professor Manitowabi accepted our invitation to speak at this inaugural public anthropology lecture. His work, his compassion and respect for others, and his professionalism rooted in the ethics of our discipline is not only admirable, but a path that I hope all take when working from within or outside academia. We are also very grateful to have Naomi Adelson here today as our discussant. Professor Adelson is a former colleague, former chair and professor emerita of the Department of Anthropology, York University. She served in the past as Associate Dean, Research for the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. She is currently the inaugural Associate Vice President of Research and Innovation at Ryerson University. Her ethnographic and theoretical work has focused on social and historical inequalities as they relate to the body and health. Her most recent book is Being Alive Well, Health and Politics of Cree Wellbeing. Professor Adelson has worked collaboratively with the Wapmagoostui Cree of Northern Quebec for more than 30 years. She is currently working with the community to digitally archive her research data to eventually transfer that data in all rights to the community. She will be co-hosting a virtual SSHRC Connection event on this topic in April 2021, entitled Rethinking the Responsibilities of the Social Science Researcher in Supporting the Advancement of Indigenous Data Sovereignty. So I'd like you to welcome both of them, and I'm just going to mention our format for questions afterwards. We're going to take questions by chat, and then we will pose them to the presenter and discussant. So you can submit your questions by chat. So please unmute your mics and please give me a hand in welcoming Darrel Manitowabi. Darrel?
Yes, miigwech, kinawaya ki bajaik, Darrel Manitowabi dishna kaz, wikom kondonjabao dawa nishnabe dao. So I'm just going to, well, thank you very much for inviting me to this prestigious inaugural event. I will present a hybrid lecture, and what I mean by this is I will reflect upon the work that I do as an applied anthropologist, and also integrate some anthropology within that, the academic approach to things as we normally do, but it will be less so a traditional anthropological lecture and more so a hybrid of all of that, of all of what that means. So when I introduced myself, I said my name was Darrel Manitowabi. I said I come from a place called Wikwemkong. My home community is known as Wikwemkong Unceded Territory. And the picture that you see here that is on the background of this slide is the south portion of the reserve southeastern Manitoulin Island. We consider, some of us consider our territory to be unceded, meaning that we have not actually engaged in a treaty making process. And I am actually registered as a non-treaty Indigenous person with my band. I can answer questions about what that means if there's time when the moment arises. I now live in the Whitefish River First Nation, which is just north of my home community, which is just north of Manitowabi Island. I initially started my work as an Indigenous person applying medical anthropology. And now I've become an Indigenous applied medical anthropologist. I think, you know, essentially I am doing the same thing, but, you know, in times and places, things change, names changes. And also I've always done public anthropology, but at the time it wasn't called public anthropology, right? So it's a relatively new term. So I've always been engaged in this process of finding a way to make anthropology relevant. So what originally brought me to anthropology was the possibility of making a contribution to community, and contribution in the sense that there is a certain approach to doing things in anthropology that have relevance to Indigenous communities. And this is in spite of the challenging history that anthropology has with Indigenous people. So I recognize that it's there. So in a lot of my work, I've recognized that tension, but I've actually moved beyond it, because I think that if we focus on the tension between Indigenous peoples and anthropology, it actually diverts the energy that we have to contribute to a greater understanding of things. So in a lot of my work, I don't exhaust my time critiquing that relationship. I actually acknowledge that it's there, and I move forward in trying to address that. So a lot of my work has been a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I've done work in terms of community development. I've done work in terms of economic development, cultural development, and development is not the greatest word to use today, but back when we used it, we didn't mean it in the way that it's critiqued within anthropology. And so I've also done a lot of medical anthropology. So a lot of my work then has been about applying this work. And I do a lot of work with oral histories, which is common with how anthropologists do their work. And so what I'm going to do today is going to talk about essentially how I was able to apply anthropology outside of the usual frameworks that I've been working with. So I've always worked within the academy, within the institution, to apply for CIHR or SSHRC grants, and use that research funding to lead research projects in community. This particular experience existed outside of that, and so I'm going to talk about that. So when I use the title Behind the Paradise of Cottage Country, and it was I had some help in helping to frame this through Carl and others, for the reason that sometimes places give a different picture, or they offer a different viewpoint of things, and sometimes we're not always aware of the complications of place, and perhaps even the complications of paradise. And I think a lot of what anthropologists have been able to do is contribute to a narrative of the complications of paradise. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And so I don't have a whole lot of time. What I've done is I've sketched together an idea that I have by way of jotting down things on paper, by way of an early draft of perhaps 2 future articles. I'm not going to, so some of that will be the focus of the discussion. However, I will expand upon some of these core issues here, and I don't have time to talk about all that there is to say about this. There's quite a bit of information here, and so I will accommodate accordingly. So I will talk about treaties, Indigenous wellness, and applying anthropology. The Indigenous wellness comes along here as a theoretical contribution to some work that I'm doing, and I'll talk about that in a moment here. And of course, this deals with treaties. So I can see, okay, here we go. So in terms of a presentation overview, so I'm going to begin with Gwedwewanskuzit, which is what Mary had shared with us earlier. And I'll talk a little bit about that before I formally begin my research overview and the details of that. So basically what I'll also do is talk about the previous research that I've done in the Chippewas of Rama. I'm also known as Chippewas of Rama Majikining. And so I'll situate that in terms of how that led to the work that I did here in this presentation. I'll give a background of the Williams Treaties. I'll also give some context to the oral history. And I'd like to talk about Menajamadzawin, which is a term. So some of you who are familiar with Algonquian studies will be familiar with the term Minopomadzawin. It seems to be all over the place now. There's more of it being referenced in different kinds of contexts, even in universities, university curriculum. The converse of that, or the opposite of that state of being, is menashe, which is actually to be ill, to have ill health. So I'll talk a bit about that, and I'll talk about more specifically in terms of applied anthropology, the ethics of being an oral history expert. And this is something that I thought about as I was doing this work, and we'll cover that in as much detail as is possible with the time constraints. So I'm going to begin with return back to what Mary was talking about. And I'll just first off say that, you know, all of those stakeholders who were involved with bringing attention to this, I just want to thank you. So Chimigwech, and I say Chimigwech for the reason, and Chimigwech means a big thank you, for the reason that I had come across Gudwewangzawit, but I haven't really taken the time to pause and reflect. I live in community, so I live in Whitefish River First Nation, and these kinds of things are there, but sometimes we don't pause to think and reflect and pay attention. And so when this symbol, and you could see the symbol in the poster, but you could also see the symbol in this slide here, when the symbol was used by accident, well, not really by accident, but you know, without proper consultations in place, it provided me with an opportunity to think about this and to look into it more. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to recite the preamble to Gudwewangzawit, Anishinaabe, and I'll just say that I am not fluent in Anishinaabe. I understand more than I can speak. My parents are fluent in it, but I would come up the generation where they wanted us to master the English language, and they discouraged the learning of our original language to me. And so my accent, I think, is almost there, but if you're a fluent speaker, then you'll know that, you know, I don't quite got it quite down right. So I will say the preamble. The Benjaget gi son Anishinaabe king gi bit one gaden amnedo watzawin shkuden ne ke noden gi bed gustonan we nagdo wendamang one pish kakamakang the Benjaget gi minan getcho wendaguk Nishnabem wan nagdonjin ninda nijwaswek no madwin Zagadewen de bwewin na den muwin Bwakawin da den dizawin Gwekwadzawin minwa akadewin the Benjaget kin min gona de binwa we nakado wendamin ka na den dana gabi jwebak minwa nankwa make wa jwebak mino gyabe wa ne jwebak. So the translation of this is as follows. One Anishinaabe family, Creator placed the Anishinaabe on the earth along with the gift of spirituality. Here on Mother Earth, there were 4 gifts given to the Anishinaabe to look after: fire, water, earth, and wind. The Creator also gave the Anishinaabe 7 sacred gifts to guide them. They are love, truth, respect, wisdom, humility, honesty, and bravery. Creator gave us sovereignty to govern ourselves. We respect and honor the past, present, and future. So I'm going to talk about the meaning of those symbols in part here. So the symbol that is to the top, which is the north, means Creator placed Anishinaabe on earth. The one that is to the northeast represents the 4 gifts: fire, water, earth, and wind. To the southeast is 7 sacred teachings. To the southwest, Creator gave us sovereignty. Northwest, honoring past, present, and future. And one thing that is apparent in this concept of one family is how many of the interconnections exist. And I think it's telling that these interconnections exist, I think, in the same way that an indigenous knowledge of the Muskokas exists. It's there, but we don't always see it. So what I mean by this is that 6 of the First Nations that I will be talking about are members of the Anishinaabe Nation, which is an advocacy organization based in Nipissing First Nation. And I am as well a member by being a resident of both Wukumakong and Whitefish River. And also I have extended family in Bosley First Nation, which is one of the First Nations that I will be talking about, which is a signatory to the Williams Treaties. So these communities are all connected. And, you know, in the background, we have the Anishinaabe Nation recognizing treaties and recognizing the past and doing the things that they do as they have always done. And within the academy, you know, we're doing the same, and sometimes we don't always intersect. So I think this opportunity to have Mary involved really makes that connection. And it really speaks to public anthropology. And within Anishinaabe perspective, this was actually meant to happen, right? So this wasn't an accident, it wasn't random, it was actually meant to happen. So I am very thankful for those who were all part of this to make it happen in terms of this connection here with the Wangzawit. And I really look forward to following. So just a little plug for the Anishinaabe Nation. There is a vote taking place to vote for the Constitution. And I took this picture myself in Whitefish River, and you can go online and vote and contribute to Anishinaabe democracy. So let's get on to the Williams Treaty. So again, I will give you an abbreviated version of this story. There is so much to say about this. And I put Williams Treaties in quotation marks, in scare quotes, for the reason that they're not actually formally called Williams Treaties. So if you pull out the treaty from the RG10 archive, or you find a copy online, and you could find these copies online, there's nothing that says, you know, Williams Treaties. The cover of the treaties actually says treaty. And so Williams comes from one of the lawyers that was active in negotiating if we can call it a negotiation of the treaties. And so that's where the name Williams comes from. So A.S. Williams was a lawyer. So the treaties is plural, excuse me, for the reason that there were two treaties. So there wasn't one, there was two. The two treaties were signed with the Chippewa Anishinaabeg and the Mississauga Anishinaabeg. So there's this historical connection that all the Chippewa have, you know, like basically a subgroup of the Anishinaabeg, more generally speaking. There's some linguistic differences, and the same is the case with the Mississauga. So there's a common sense of kinship, if we could use that word, amongst the Chippewa that is closer than it is between the Chippewa and the Mississauga. And this is even apparent to the modern day. And you still have Christian Island, Georgina Island, and Rama having a very close connection as three communities within a general vicinity. And you also have the Mississauga the same way. I've observed that you have these communities that still hold a sense of community, of family within them. And these are the dates that the treaties were signed. And all of the Chippewa and Mississauga, the 7 First Nations of South Central Ontario, are signatories to the Williams Treaties. So what is the Williams Treaty all about is something that I will cover in this. But first, let me begin with the origin of my role in the Williams Treaties. So I didn't begin my career, my academic career, as a treaty researcher. So it's something that I just entered and through the process that I will describe here. So for my master's, I did my master's at McMaster University. I did all of my degrees in anthropology, the bachelor at Laurentian, master's at McMaster, PhD at Toronto. And when I was doing my master's research, that's when I really, well, actually, when I was doing my bachelor's research, I really found a connection to finding a better understanding the connection between socioeconomic being or economic being with health. And so my first research project was an applied diabetes research project for my bachelor's. For my master's, I initially wanted to go to the Chippewas of Rama because I wanted to understand what it looks like when a community goes from high unemployment to almost no unemployment. I wanted to see how that was changing the community. And I also wanted to see how access to funds changes the community as well, because quite often the narrative is that First Nations communities in Canada don't have enough funding, right? They don't have enough funding to invest in infrastructure and all those sorts of things. This was not possible at the master's level. I wasn't able to negotiate it. So I did my research project in Chikwenda First Nation, which is actually the home of Gordon Wundabintz, who is a lead elder in Anishinaabe Nation. So I know Gord relatively well. So I did a cultural tourism initiative there. It was essentially applied, developing a framework for the implementation of a cultural tourism initiative. When I revisited the Chippewas of Rama for my PhD, it was then possible for me to do my work there. So when I approached the Chippewas of Rama First Nation, or Chippewas of Rama, we negotiated a research project. And basically what we negotiated was that I would come into the community and help facilitate the research that they needed, that they wanted to get done. And I could as well at the same time do the research that I was doing for the purposes of my PhD, because those of you who have done this or are doing this will know that there's not always a precise alignment between the requirements of a PhD level research project and a community research project. So one of the things that I did in the community, for instance, is I helped to set up a culture and research department within the community. I started collecting some archives. I helped to set up an elders advisory committee. Some of this was already in place, but it just needed to be more formalized. And I also set up community activities. We also went into the school in Rama to provide activities. I'd like to say I was more of a facilitator, because those who had the knowledge to do things were already in the community. And being a PhD student, I was used to administrating things, working with paper, calling meetings, and all those sorts of things. So basically what I did in my PhD research is I compared and contrasted the Coldwater and the Narrows colonial experiment of 1830 to 1836 with the casino. And I want to see some comparisons there, as in terms of Indigenous state relations is how we would frame that today. In terms of how I engage with this from a theoretical level, I engaged with the Algonquian concept of Bamadzawin, which is the good life, and Naomi has written about this, the Creek equivalent in James Bay. And I also engaged with Bourdieu's habitus and neoliberalism. Back when I was doing this, neoliberalism was the thing to talk about, and so that's a bit fading to an extent now. But it was that moment in time when neoliberalism was there, and I pulled out some habitus and I pulled in some Bamadzawin, and I looked at the intersection of the three of those things. And so at the same time that I was doing my research project, my supervisor, Dr. Christina Sejahovich, an associate professor at the University of Toronto, was engaged in collecting oral history research in support of Alderville et al. Versus the Queen, which is litigation that was basically challenging, and sought to integrate the First Nations perspective on the Williams Treaties. So it's really interesting scenario where Christina was my supervisor. She was doing her own thing. And then I was, the graduate student doing my own thing as well. And when I was in the community, I would see her. I would see her going about talking to elders. I was in the administration office, the band office, and I could hear her talking to an elder near me. And at one moment in time, I also had an opportunity to observe one of the interviews she was conducting with an elder in the community. A gatekeeper in the community, his father was being interviewed, and he said to me one day, he said, your professor, he called her my professor. He said, your professor is interviewing my dad. Let's go watch. I said, sure, why not? And so we went to the home and we sat down in the kitchen, and she was interviewing an elder, and she had all of her papers out. She wasn't recording, so she was just writing things down. And I was sitting, observing, listening, and learning. And so that's really the extent to which I know that she did this research. And so we kept things separate. We recognized that, she was doing her thing and I was doing my own thing, and there wasn't necessarily direct connections because she was working on some confidential stuff. And so we didn't really talk about it a whole lot. One of the things we did say to each other is that we remarked upon the common elders we spoke to, right? So I would say, did you have a chance to speak to so-and-so? And we would just talk about how great it was an experience to talk to individuals who were so knowledgeable in the community. So we were able to independently discover or learn, learn is a better word because they're already there. We were able to learn who were the leading elders in the community and knowledge holders independently. I thought that was interesting. So unfortunately, Dr. Sejahovich passed away in 2012 due to a terminal illness. And she wasn't able to complete this work. And so this was about the time when the work would have been completed. And so she had left the file. And there was some thinking that, this wouldn't be able to move forward because of what had transpired. She had invested all of this effort. And so in 2014, I was contacted by Hutchins Legal out of Montreal, and they asked if I would be interested in completing this work, the work that Dr. Sejahovich had not yet completed. So at the time, to be quite honest, I wasn't 100% interested in taking this on. The first primary reason for this being the case is that I think it's important that one does research in all of the communities. And I had only done research in one, so Chippewas of Rama. But I had also known Beausoleil First Nation because of the reasons that I've described. I have extended family there, and there's really strong connection. And I also considered that, you know, this kind of work doesn't have a lot of value in the academy, and it requires a lot of effort. And it doesn't weigh, or at the time anyway, it didn't have the same weighting as, for instance, peer-reviewed journal articles or you know, a book with a major university press. And I realized that I would be investing a lot of time into it. And so I was debating. I was thinking, you know, should I go down this path? Because it's going to take away from my progression in the academy. It's going to take away from contributing to more scholarly articles and all that sort of thing. But then I thought about it. I realized that it was a really good opportunity to apply anthropology. And it was something that had really drawn me to the discipline. So I realized that this was an opportunity that may not come again, or may not come for a while again. And when I started thinking about the experience component, I came to the realization that many people from Ontario are working in Rama, at Casino Rama, and many come from the Williams Treaties. I think that, and I don't know this for a fact, but there may have been community members from all of the Williams Treaties First Nations working at the casino when I was there in various capacities, either in the school, working for the band office, working for the tribal council, or working within the casino itself. And so I came to the realization that through the work that I was doing in Rama, that despite the fact I wasn't in all of the communities, I had some knowledge and understanding of you know, the experiences that the community members were coming from. And for instance, one of the elders in the community would quite often want to go to Curve Lake, to their retirement home, to their nursing home, for the reason that they had faced discrimination and racism in other places. And so Curve Lake was the destination if you needed to have care as an elder. But now with the casino funds in Rama, they have their own long-term care home for community members. So this is how I came to be involved. And then I said, yes, I'll do it. And so I did it. And this is what my experience was all about. So let me talk briefly about you know, some background here. And again, I could speak about this for probably more than an hour in itself. But essentially, the Williams Treaties is a history of Anishinaabe Yup'shkawejik relations. And I use this word Yup'shkawejik just to change the narrative of this. And quite, you know, within a dominant paradigm being English, and being a dominant paradigm within the academy, we quite often use the terminology that's close to us. However, we don't often recognize that other peoples have other words for these processes. And we often do not center them in how we talk about this thing. So I'm going to center them. So for Anishinaabe, you know, one of there's different words, but I think one word that is a good general term to apply to you know, what we would call settlers is Yup'shkawejik. And Yup'shkawejik is, you know, the white people is just a general basic definition of that. But that's just how things are phrased. And Mary stated, and I recognize how problematic any term is when we apply to peoples, but I don't have time to talk about that here today. But, you know, I recognize that. And so I will use Anishinaabe Yup'shkawejik relations as a framework for understanding how this all came about. And basically this all comes about in the 1700s. So if you have followed history of Southern Ontario, then known as Upper Canada, you will know that you know, things were not necessarily expected to come out the way that they came out, right? And so within the Anishinaabe perspective, you had the Five Nations Iroquois in the south, and you had the Wendat Huron as well in the south, and you had a dispersal happen, and there's plenty of research in this. And then you had the Anishinaabe, who were allies with the Wendat, and they came in to reclaim some of that territory, and that speaks for the presence of the Chippewa and the Mississauga in this region. So the place of the Muskokas is as I've come to know, and you know, there's more to understand here, is the traditional hunting territory of Chief Yellowhead. And a Muskoka is actually one of the Anishinaabe Noswin, the native name of Yellowhead, and it means, as I would understand it, red earth. And so that word or that place, when we say the Muskokas, it's actually named after the ancestral chief of the Chippewas of Rama, known as Yellowhead. So just really quickly, a little bit about the Coldwater and the experiment. I think really it speaks to what would come and speaks to what would result. And so after the War of 1812, all of the loyalist movement into Upper Canada, you had a problem. You had a problem, and the problem was that there was a requirement for land for those loyalists moving in. Oh, I hear some feedback a little bit in the background there. I think someone's maybe not on mute, so please mute if you're not on mute. And so in 1830 to 1836, there was this grand colonial plan to move all of the Indigenous peoples of Southern Ontario onto one central reserve. And it's approximately at the location of that red dot that you see on that map. And the intention here was to educate and assimilate, essentially, and to, most importantly, free up the land. Because if you have hunting groups that are using more land, more real estate, if you confine them to a smaller plot of land, then you open up the land that they were hunting on for the purposes of settlement. So this was the intention. It essentially didn't work out for the reason that not all of the other groups wanted to move there, and those who were willing to stay were those who were already there, such as the Chippewas of Rama. And so they terminated it in 1836, and the Chippewas of Rama were forced under Yellowhead to purchase their own land on the shore of Lake Couchiching, where the contemporary First Nation is the Chippewas of Rama. North of this area is, and I'm just using my cursor here to show, is the northern hunting grounds of the Chippewa and the Mississauga. And if we can even just go a little bit here, we're cutting into Algonquin territory, I recognize that, but for the purposes of my presentation, I'm going to talk about Chippewa and Mississauga northern hunting grounds. And essentially this is Lake Huron to the French River, Mattawa and Ottawa. And so it's a vast territory. And if you've been through that area, been to Algonquin Park, you know, you're in the traditional northern hunting grounds of the Chippewa and the Mississauga of South Central Ontario. However, within this time period, you had increasing settlement, you had increasing timber and resource extraction happening. And you had the Chippewa and the Mississauga lobbying government to do something about it, because they recognize that things are changing. And in this period, the period of about 100 years, from about 1830 to 1930, you had this shift in dynamic in this area. And this is really the background of the Williams Treaties. So what is the history of the treaties themselves? So then you have, within the written record, you have a documented history of indifference to Indigenous title. So essentially, if you read, and a good book as an overview is Peggy Blair's book, goes over its Lament for the First Nations, looks at this from a historical legal perspective. So basically, what you read about when you read Peggy's book, you read about the federal provincial obfuscation of this issue. They would always pass it on to, the feds would pass it on to the province, or the province would say, well, that's a federal responsibility. This is something that continues to this day. And also you have this increasing, disciplining colonial power of the state. And so you had the First Nations requesting lawyers. They actually hired lawyers, and the Indian Affairs were directed to stop the process, because the First Nations were not allowed to seek the assistance of lawyers. So you can read about all of these details in Peggy Blair's book if you want to learn a bit more. So in terms of the record, and so things don't really begin to become serious until 1916. And so in 1916, the Federal Minister of Justice, R.V. St. Clair, was appointed to examine the merit of the Chippewa and Mississauga claim. And this is the words taken from the report, and I'll quote it. So the Indian title to these lands has never been extinguished, and I am of the opinion that some arrangement should be made for quieting the title by the payment to the claimants of compensation in the same way that the Crown has dealt with other Indians whose title has been extinguished by treaty, end quote. And so you have A.S. Williams, who is a Toronto lawyer, appointed to be part of a 3-man commission. On April 23rd, 1923, the commission concludes as following. It is of the opinion of the commission that the claimants have submitted ample and satisfactory proof of the occupation of them of the land referred to as the ancient hunting grounds of the ancestors of the claimants. These hunting grounds cover an area of over 10,000 square miles of territory, the value of which is almost incalculable. So this report was the one that really moved forward this requirement to cede the title. And so this is in April 23rd of 1923, and you will recall that this was all wrapped up in October and November. So it's really interesting how this happened so quickly, that the Chippewa and the Mississauga are requesting that this be addressed over decades and decades, and over the span of 4 to 6 months, it's dealt with. So if you look at the details of which, and there's not always a whole lot of details of this in the historical record, you see that there's little compensation. And as I've mentioned here, the assessment is that the value is almost incalculable. So the province of Ontario was only willing to pay out $500,000, which was the amount of the day. You have as well no rights of the First Nations, and you could read this in Surtees. Surtees is a historian, and Blair is a historian lawyer. They had no lawyers. So when the actual signing of the treaties happened, they were not allowed to have their own lawyers. They were explicitly told that we are lawyers. A.S. Williams says this as well, and amongst others, that we are lawyers and we can act on your behalf. And so if you're a lawyer, you know how that's problematic. There were no translators. Sorry, there was a translator. And one of those translators was Sam Snake at Rama. He's identified as being a translator. And so it shows that, you know, there's obviously Anishinaabe, the language of the Ojibwe, as being the primary language. And what's also noted is the accelerated negotiations. They happen very quickly. And what's also really interesting about this is that they don't have any hunting, fishing, harvesting rights that are part of the treaty. So it's almost like an anomaly. So if you read Surtees in his conservative, I would classify it as a bit of a conservative historical perspective. Even within his conservative historical writing, you come out thinking that, wow, this was very interesting. Like, was this possible that this happened this way? And if you look at Blair, Blair is a bit more critically engaged, and it's a bit of a sign of the times and looks at things in more detail. So I think Blair has some ideas as to why this happened so quickly. So I'm going to accelerate a little bit given the amount of time that we have here. So Christina Secehowicz, before she was able to complete her report, had done 174 interviews with members of the 7 First Nations. This was a 94-question semi-structured survey, question guide. In total, there are 4,000 pages that comprise of her data. And she had drafted some findings. She talked about her methodology. She had completed an analysis, and she was on her way to completing the work, but it wasn't a finished product. And so when I took on the work, I had, you know, I chose to do a reanalysis of it all. And so what I did is I used grounded theory. I thought it was an interesting way of applying it for the reason that I didn't know a lot about the Williams Treaties. I had read Surtees' report. I had known a little bit about Blair. I focused all on the Rama stuff in Blair's book. I didn't actually read the other stuff about the Williams Treaty. So I was, in many ways, I didn't know a lot about it. I didn't know about the oral history of it because I had not yet tried to better understand it. And it was the first time I actually learned about it. So what I did in my analysis is that I focused on 3 components. So I wanted to understand what was the way of life at the time of treaties. And the first finding, so this first section and component, I found that there was a heavy reliance on hunting, fishing, gardens, and bartering. And there were many narratives of individuals who would trade with nearby Yup'ishkawajik farmers. They would trade food. And so there was a bit of a collaborative relationship that existed, but there was a very strong and clear reliance on hunting and fishing, a bit of a mixed economy at the time. So there was an accommodation of the new economy coming along, but there was still a reliance on that. And I also wanted to understand what were the signing of the treaties like? And so all of these individuals mentioned, there was one who was interviewed who was a young child at the time of the treaties signings. And he recalls peering through a window at the community hall where the treaty was signed, and he observes viewing it, but he wasn't able to hear what they were talking about. So he knew that it was happening. So most of those would have known some of the details through the signatories. So they would have known directly the signatories. And so one of the things that is apparent in the interviews is that most of the signatories spoke Anishinaabemowin as their first language. And you could see this in, Sam Snake's, requirement as being a translator at the treaties. Most had at the highest level the equivalent of a grade 4 education. They call it book 4 level at that time. They experienced material poverty at the time. They also have a strong oral history of rights, of hunting rights, fishing rights as they understood them. And they also talked about their understanding that there would be additional lands as being part of the Williams Treaties, and that there would be additional compensation. And there's this narrative of big monies. Big monies comes out as a reoccurring word that comes out in the interviews themselves. And then I next looked at the impact of the treaties. And one of the focus, one of the areas that Chris had taken a look at is the impact on health. Like, how is this impacting your health? And so people talked about pollution, increasing pollution with the higher populations that are occurring around them. They talk about conflict with farmers. People are actually being shot at by farmers who they're trying to cross the farmer fields, following their historic hunting routes, and they're actually being shot at. And they also talk about increasing conflict with game wardens, and they would have to hunt undercover, so even fish undercover. So for instance, I remember this narrative of elder in Christian Island would talk about going fishing out in Georgian Bay and staying on the water all night to avoid the detection from the game warden. And so he would have to do that because otherwise, it would cause some problems. And also there's this narrative of a shifting economy. For the reasons of this, the community members had to rely upon tourism, for instance, as an example for additional livelihood. So I'll next move on to the testimony. So what's unique about this, this litigation is the inclusion of First Nations elders in the community testimony. And I wasn't a lawyer in this process, so I can't speak to all of the details and reasons for this, but it's my opinion that they brought in the lawyers to verify the authenticity of the Sejahovich interviews. And at the time, there were still some elders who were alive and able to speak to that. And so in October and November of 2015, they held community testimony in the Chippewas of Rama and Curve Lake. And I had attended some of this testimony and I was looking forward to it. It's almost like you read the novel and the movie comes out and you know all of the details of the novel and you can't wait to see those folks in person. So I was really looking forward to see some of these elders because I could just read their words. But I had also known some of them in Rama. And when I was reading what they had to say, I could actually see their face. I can hear their voice because I sat and I spoke to them and I knew some of them rather well. And so what you find in this testimony is that the elders are confirming a reliance on hunting and fishing. And what was really poignant in the testimony was the fact that the elders who were testifying had trouble comprehending the English language used by lawyers. They had to constantly reframe, restate, and sometimes they had to ask the question 3 different times so that the elder could understand. And in some instances, an elder knew or would speak Anishinaabemowin as their first language. And in Rama, for instance, there was impromptu translation, that there was another elder in the audience who during the break would say, "Do you want me to translate?" And went to talk to the elder and was basically translating what was going on. And I also observed this in Curve Lake, where one of the elders brought her daughter with her to act as a translator because her first language was still Anishinaabemowin and she wasn't comfortable speaking English. So what I found was that it was history repeating itself, which was really interesting. And it was interesting as well that in October and November, there was some who couldn't attend because they were hunting. They were out hunting. And this is something that was in the oral history as well, that some signatories could not be present at the original treaties signings because they were out hunting. And so it was history repeating itself in almost all ways. Like, I wondered what the community was thinking, having these outsiders coming to their communities and the lawyers driving their Escalades and their, all of these, the court clerks and all of these folks coming in like this army with these dark, nice cars coming in. They go into the community hall. They're speaking a language that not everyone can understand. and all of a sudden they're gone again, right? They're collecting, official information, and the elders are forced to respond to it in the same way. So in terms of the response to the work that I did, Ontario sought the services of John Dewhurst, who is a consultant based in British Columbia. And the position that Dewhurst took was that the methodology that Christina used was flawed, and therefore my report was flawed because I relied upon flawed information. And this was specific to Christina's preference to not audio record. She would actually take notes, and she had developed a skill that she could write really quickly what people were saying. And Dewhurst thought that, well, it's in modern day, you can record, and you could use also some new technology to do an analysis of the information, such as the in vivo. And so we know all about that as anthropologists who are doing this research. But she did it I would say the traditional way of doing anthropology. And she did it for a particular purpose, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The qualifications of John Dewhurst is that he was an archaeologist initially. He's done research in ethnohistory, and he's also done research mostly in central Canada and Western Canada. The expert for Canada was Alexander von Garnett, who basically came to the conclusion that there is no oral history of the treaties. And the reason for this is because there were no living witnesses to the treaty, and he focused almost exclusively on having a witness, a first-hand witness of the treaty. And so that was the approach he took. Von Garnett's qualifications are, he initially started off as an archaeologist. He's integrated ethnohistory now, and he classifies himself as an ethnologist. He's actually not done research with Indigenous peoples, meaning underground, interviewing face-to-face. So he critiques, I suppose, and compares the ethnographies that the rest of us do. And so let me go on then to the discussion and the conclusion. And I'm really curious to have some questions here. What does this mean? How do we understand this within the literature, and how do we understand this as an anthropological phenomenon, right? And so Colin Sampson talks about extinguishment in his work, A Way of Life That Once Existed Amongst the Ainu of Newfoundland. And he talks explicitly about this state objective of extinguishing the Ainu through colonial processes, right? So having title over land, and then operationalizing the colonial machinery of policies. And I find some comparison there as well, this idea of the Williams Treaties being Indigenous extinguishment, having Indigenous people cede title to land, and creating the conditions of a difficult existence, and surrounding of a new dominant political and economic structure that Indigenous peoples are left with, trying to find a way to navigate. And if you know a little bit more about the contemporary issues in these communities, then you could probably speak more about that better than I can. So what does this mean in terms of its relationship then to the work that I do, to medical anthropology? And so quite often, this kind of literature focuses on good health, right? So it's really the absence of or the pursuit of. So it's a focus on good. How do we achieve wellness and goodness for First Nations communities? And when I started to reflect upon that, I came to the realization that this is an actual narrative of ill health, that those who are part of the interviews, they're talking about how the treaties displaced their connection to land. It also displaced their connection to community. So you had community that would do as a collective to go out to hunt together, to go fish together. When I was in Rama, we went up to Port Carling, and the community showed me how life was like at Port Carling, and they still recognize this connection, and Port Carling is in some ways the heart of Muskoka. And so you have food insecurity happening, and you have this new colonial life world surrounding the people. And there's a higher degree of community stress, in my opinion, in terms of Anishinaabeg and Yup'ishkawajik relations in this area, and even Southern Ontario, due to increasing levels of population, and Indigenous peoples as being markers of the past, being markers of Canada's colonial past. And so, so that's how I see this contribution being made there. But more specifically to applied anthropology, it raises the question of who is an oral history expert, and how do we come to know and validate what does that mean? And so in my opinion, in this Alderville et al., the minimum qualification was to have a graduate degree in anthropology and have some research experience. That's my interpretation, and others may have a different interpretation. What do we know about this? So Delgamuukw, there's plenty of anthropological literature on this. And in Delgamuukw, the anthropologists were classified as advocates, right? So they were not actually objective or neutral, they were advocates, but the same argument was not applied to the state anthropologist, Robinson, in that instance. So what did Alderville become? So it became really a defense of methods. And it was, Arthur Ray calls testimony being like an inquisition. And I would agree with that it is like an inquisition. It's a high-paced, high-energy attempt at disqualifying any sense of authority or expertise that I may think I have, I suppose. And so it all became about a defense of methods. I defended the anthropological method, and I also defended the oral history method. And I stated that Dr. Sejahovic explicitly did not record interviews because she was abiding by the AAA, the American Anthropological Association Code of Ethics, to do no harm. And she did so for the reason that she had some control over that knowledge. So if you record it and it becomes something in itself, and others can take it and manipulate it, I suppose, or treat it in the way that they will do so. But she saw her writing down of the information as a way of being a conduit, of having a role to play in the dissemination, because the way she wrote, she stated to me that, well, if they want to take my notes, they can take it because I write very sloppily. And if they want to know what I said, then they have to ask me to explain what I said there. And so she saw this as a way of doing no harm for the, abiding by, this anthropological ethic that we have. So this is really the question that I raise here in terms of applied anthropology, and how do we begin to understand a way forward, right? So it's, in my opinion, it's very divisive. The Court of Law and Arthur Ray, I think he does a really good job with, really highlighting some of these challenges here. Sometimes you have anthropologists pitted against their students, or historians pitted against their students because their students take on the role of contracted consultant as an expert. I think we need to arrive at some level of collaboration between Indigenous academics, anthropologists, and also lawyers to really educate about what does this all mean. Because in my opinion, I think you actually do harm to people when you are not appropriately qualified to speak on their own behalf, on the behalf of their oral histories. And I took it very seriously that I needed to understand what I was doing. I needed to have some sense of the land and the connection. I recall being in Rama, sitting around the fire, talking to an elder, the boiling sap for making maple syrup. And there's a certain level of engagement and embodiment that you take away from you when you have that kind of connection with people. And so when you go to when I went to Port Carling, I was on the land, I was on the Northern Hunting Territory, and I was hearing a perspective of the past that is not common knowledge for many people. So on November 17, 2018, the federal government of Canada apologized to the Chippewa and the Mississauga. This took place at the Chippewas of Rama. I wasn't able to attend, but I did read the news on it. And the actual apology can be found online. You can read the script of it. And what really struck me is that the apology relied heavily on the oral history. When I was reading the apology, I recognized the narrative themes that I was able to draw from in the Sejahovic interviews. And really what the end result then is a return of hunting, return of fishing rights, return of harvesting rights, some more land, and additional compensation. So really it rectified some of the challenges of this. And I think it moves forward oral history in the court beyond Delgamuukw. And so what is the future then? I leave us to think about what is the future. And returning back to Colin Sampson, is it to regain a way of life that once existed? And so it's a question. So some may think that, well, you know, it's not possible to replicate precisely how these things happened in the past. But I'm doing contemporary research that looks at how land is being incorporated into cultural healing programs to address opioid addiction. And right now I'm working with North Shore First Nations, trying to find ways of bringing youth onto the land to make these reconnections. And so I think it is possible for the Chippewa and the Mississauga to find a way of life that once existed, but it'll be a way of life that once existed in a completely different context. And I think it will be possible. And I think the work of anthropology, applied anthropology, and applied Indigenous scholars can really lead to this outcome. So thank you very much for this opportunity to speak at this first inaugural public anthropology lecture. And I look forward to your questions. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Darrel.